So Tim, this is going to be an interview that we're going to put out as part of a little series called Jordan Peterson and the Left, or What Can the Left Learn from Jordan Peterson? We got in contact first because you wrote the first Spectator profile of Jordan Peterson at about the same time as I brought out my documentary. And you've described yourself as an old lefty. So I think it's really interesting to kind of to pull that apart, kind of what have the reactions been to what you've put out there? What have you gone on a journey with all of that stuff? And what do you find kind of really enticing about Jordan Peterson?
So I am from a working class background in London. I was a journalist when I started off. Then I started writing books. I've also worked in the meantime as a journalist for The Guardian primarily. I've been a columnist on The Guardian until the end of last year. But I've always seen The Guardian as my natural home. I've read The Guardian for as long as I can remember, so that I'm certainly a leftist to that extent.
Mm. And we've pretty much probably discovered Jordan Peterson at more or less the same time, maybe. Or had you?
I think I was first.
You've known him a bit before.
Well, I don't know. I don't even remember how I came across Jordan Peterson, other than in the context, because one thing I haven't said about my career is I now, as well as write books, teach writing, and I've been studying how stories are generated and the shapes of stories and the structure of stories, and that's how I came across Jordan Peterson way before we got into this whole debate, which has somehow got all entangled with politics, which I've never seen Peterson primarily as a political figure. I mean, I know people interpret him that way, and in some ways he is a political figure, but that's kind of not what interests me about him. What interests me about Peterson is a purely professional interest in some ways, is his understanding of where stories come from and why we need them and how they are laid out in our imaginations, both psychologically and in terms of the culture. In other words, in films, in theatre, in whatever, in novels. I mean, you know, if my practical question was, if I can crack the problem of what makes for a compelling story, it's going to make me a better novelist, you know, and I'll be able to use that tool and teach that tool. And Jordan gives some brilliant lectures on stories, whether they're The Lion King or whether they're Hamlet, or whether they are the
Bible.
But well, I'll get to the Bible. But the smaller stories like Pinocchio, you know, these modern fables. That was his starting point, as it were. And I followed all those stories. His analysis of these stories, Beauty and the Beast being another one, Pocahontas. You know, his analysis of Pinocchio was particularly brilliant. You know, and I've tried to, you know, I've read Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, Eric Fromm, you know, who wrote The Uses of Enchantment about children's stories. I've always been gripped by the idea that there's a kind of underlying story bubbling up in us all, that we're, as artists, trying to somehow inflect in our own way, but it's always, in some senses, the same story. And if it is the same story, what does that story mean? What is that story? Why does that make us moved or interested or involved? And that's where I think Jordan Peterson is absolutely fascinating. He's fascinating about how the individual, well, he's a psychologist, and it's the how this thing works with respect to psychology. And the most important thing for me, quite apart from his work with, you know, these stories, modern myths, was, as you say, his investigation into the Bible. And I've always been fascinated, although I'm an atheist, I've always been fascinated by the power of the biblical stories. I've often found myself looking at these huge cathedrals and churches that sprouted up all over Europe, you know, and I asked myself, well, what's that about? You know, why was this story so powerful? I mean, yeah, it's a defense against death if you want to be cynical, but hey, you know, it could be lots of other stories, you know, and why is this one so unbelievably powerful? And what does it mean for it to be so powerful? And Peterson, I think, brilliantly answers that question in the biblical lectures, he's done, and he really changed me, those lectures. He genuinely did, I think, change the way I lived my life, because he came to this very, very important conclusion, which I'm pretty convinced by. I don't think I'm ever 100% convinced by anything, but I'm very convinced by his idea, as I'm someone who's suffered depression, and depression is like a crisis of meaning in your. And it's the worst thing about depression. It's not about being miserable. It's having a life that seems utterly meaningless, and that's why it's such torment. And Peterson, in a way, tries to answer the question: how do we, as an individual? That's a bit of a paradox. How do I, as an individual, acquire meaning? Because meaning is the most important thing any of us could have. You know, there's meaning is it. You know, if you don't know, and yet no one can quite say what meaning is, which I think is interesting in itself. Everyone says, well, I want a sense of meaning. Well, what is a sense of meaning? What is meaning? And Peterson, I think, acknowledges that mystery, but also says, well, you know, if you want a sense of meaning, it's not about just doing what you want. It's not about just following your bliss, as Joseph Campbell would be, or having as much fun as possible, or even necessarily being
happy.
No, absolutely not necessarily being happy. There are more important things than being happy, and I've also found that to be true in my life. I'm 62 now, and I've been through a lot, you know, and I found that many things, that unhappiness has given me so much. You know, unhappiness has given me so much in terms of meaning. Trying to pick through the bones out of one's unhappiness is what one enriches you, and that's the story. That is the story of nearly all great stories. That suffering is a way of raising yourself above your animal condition, if you choose to let it be. And that the suffering that involves in a change in yourself, and this is what we teach in story narrative, which all great stories are about a change of one condition into another condition, and that's what makes a story compelling. It's this making this change, and the pursuit of this goal of change is what we mean when we talk about meaning. That somehow to aim for something higher than yourself, even if you can't quite name it. I mean, I would use, you know, that aim, the word for that aim, as authenticity, maybe. That's one of the words I might use to try and discover my own goal, is to be an authentic person, to be a real person. Because I had a very strong sense when I was younger that I wasn't very real, that I was kind of two-dimensional, that I was a bit like a cardboard cutout, and I could be blown away by the wind at any moment. And my experience of life, I'm going through a fair bit of suffering, I would say, as everybody does, but I think I've probably had, you know, probably some worse experiences than some, better experiences than other. That this suffering has forced me to engage with what it means to be alive, and has enriched me in some sense. And that struck a very loud chord when I, you know, not that I in any way glamorize, so I don't think anyone should seek out suffering, you know, but I was very taken by Peterson's message that life is, it's not about being happy, life is about suffering. Okay, well that sounds it's a bit Eeyore-ish in this day and age, when a lot of people have a very pleasant life, you know, and they don't really suffer that much. And I get that, you know, you can have a very nice life. It's just not a very deep life, you know, it's just not a very profound or resonant life. And somehow, in my experience, when I meet people who've been through really lousy crap, somehow they're kind of interesting. You know, they're more interesting, they're richer, they're deeper. And they may be, and others might just be, you know, might have done the wrong thing with that stuff and become just boring assholes, you know. But I mean, but it gives you a strange opportunity, because when you're, you know, in a crisis, you have to question your life very deeply, and you have to say, what's gone wrong? Now, as Peterson would point out, a very common response to that is, Someone else did that to me. Society did that to me. The ruling class did that to me. Men did that to me. Women did that to me. White people did that to me, you know. And there's something in that. But it's not really a sufficient, or in my case, you know, as a working class boy, not very working class anymore, you know, the ruling class, the wealthy people, the upper class did that to me, you know, deprived me of a decent education, deprived me of any material pleasures when I was, up until I made my own money, you know. But it's not, you know, and I really have a gut resistance, perhaps again from my background as a kind of sort of respectable working class self-help kind of ethic, that it doesn't do you any good, even if it's true, to cast yourself in that role. Your story is not going to be a very good one. It's not going to be a very nourishing one if you put yourself in that role. It might be easy, it might be in short term, you know, it's rather like junk food, a junk thought. It's like, oh, it's all their fault. Yeah, it's a little bit their fault, but as Peterson says, it's also a little bit your fault, and maybe it's a lot your fault, you know. And you've got to watch that thought, because if you're depressive like I am, you know how that can flip over into a kind of acute pathological guilt about sort of, you know, I'm the worst person in the world because everything's my fault. And I think that's a danger. I've spoken to Jordan about this idea that, you know, this idea of intense personal responsibility, which he advocates. I'm not so much with him on that. You know, I think you can get a bit carried away. But I do think the modern left has lost touch with that essential liberal trope that we as human beings at our deepest level are individual souls that are of value, you know, and that we have an intrinsic instinct, as it were, for morality, and that morality is important. And that's the modern project. Let's not think about it, you know, and let's get on with our lives. Let's buy our iPhones. Let's stay online. Let's watch Love Island. But let's not think about it, because actually it's not really a soluble problem. And, you know, it's all about power anyway, blah, 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 blah. Well, you know, maybe it is a soluble problem. And I think Jordan Peterson is the first person in some ways, not the first person, there are other people. Alan Watts is one of them, and Joseph Campbell's another, who've really, you know, and Jung, are people who've really approached that question. But I'm not a great one for distracting myself from the big problems of life, because I wouldn't be a very good novelist if I was. But with that territory goes a lot of uncertainty and fear, and I guess the two go together, and yet also fascination and meaning.
And I guess I have a similar take, and why, after I interviewed Jordan in October last year, I then kind of thought, okay, I want to turn this into a documentary, precisely because I had a real sense of how important and how meaningful his message was, and I'd already got this real impression that it was being lost on a lot of people because they couldn't get past the political stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so that's why I made it into the documentary that I did, was to try and create, because it's so impenetrable. I mean, where do you start with Jordan Peterson? There's all of these lecture series. There's so many different ways in, or there's so many difficult ways in, because you've got to watch so much of it to understand. And so I tried to make this documentary to kind of, I guess I already had in the back of my mind a lot of my progressive friends and their kind of reactivity to what he was saying, and to try and say, no, look at what he's actually saying, look at the kind of Jungian underpinnings, look at the story, look at the deeper message of what he's doing. And I guess it's been a constant kind of, I found myself in that conversation so often of, and I mean, we both feel like the political lens is probably not the right one to look at Jordan Peterson through, but it's almost impossible in this highly politicized world not to kind of look at him through that lens, or at least for him to be pulled into that frame all the time. So I'm interested, as a fellow, like we both probably consider ourselves at least, or coming from the left.
Yes.
So I'd love to hear, have you had arguments with people?
Many arguments, but though I've kind of given up, you know, because and it's really been quite depressing in a way. I mean, when one tries to, and this is really one of the things that Peterson rails against, and I think very rightly, is that when one tries to engage with people on certain subjects, they're very resistant to discussion. They'll rather just start shouting at you or accusing you that you're being, a fascist or something, or a sexist or something, Or they'll throw personal abuse at you. And instead of saying, yeah, okay, all right, well, you might not find this a very attractive, but what's your answer? What's your rational, I mean, if Jordan Peterson has a meta study showing that men and women are fundamentally different in the way they behave in all cultures, and there are like hundreds of studies that all show the same thing, what do you say to that? I mean, I don't think it's political.
That he's sexist.
Well, that's what they say to that, but it's like, why is that sexist? I mean, you don't, it isn't sexist at all to me to say that men and women might, and you only have to say might to get into big trouble, might have different inborn proclivities. And this is the reason it's so taboo, is because the social constructionist view has so gripped the left. And I thought it had died, at the end of the coming down of the Berlin Wall and the failures of Maoism, the failures of communism generally, which is embedded in a whole mindset, Marxism and later post-Marxism. I didn't say that when I was at university I studied political science. So, like Jordan, I studied totalitarianism, and I studied the Russians, and I studied how the mindset worked. And it was terrifying. Like him, I just thought, this is terrifying. But I thought it had gone, I thought that was dead. But what I've seen is it being, its recrudescence through the academy, through the universities. Suddenly it's back. The difference is they don't know it's Marxism, or they call it postmodernism. But in fact, it's the idea that only power matters, that there's no absolute truths, that all truths are relative. This to me is garbage. You can make an intellectual argument about it, but it's still very patently not true. That some values, don't tell me that dignity isn't a real thing. Don't tell me that respect isn't a real thing. Don't tell me that love isn't a real thing. That it's all power. It's not true. I know it because I know my inner self. And my final point of reference is my inner self, my soul, if you want to use religious terminology, though I'm not religious. But my soul is where I look for my final authority, not to the group that I belong to, or not to the group that anybody else belongs to. I'm not interested in that. I mean, I'm vaguely interested, and I recognise it has a part to play. But finally and fundamentally, it's the individual that matters. And how could I think anything otherwise as a writer? If any job is about the individual voice, it's the job of the novelist. Films are collective projects. Writing a novel is the ultimate individual act, the ultimate individual voice. And even that is coming under pressure now. People they have I think they're called something like, they're not called morality readers, but they're something
diversity
like
reader.
Diversity readers. They have editors now who check, that you don't have any inappropriate opinions in your, even for your characters. That is a really deep sickness, as far as I'm concerned. That is totalitarian thought. And it's totalitarian thought, not in the government, but it's the totalitarian thought mindset that I see on the march. It hasn't expressed itself in government yet. We're still basically a pluralist society. But that mindset that's, I know what's right, and you, if you don't agree with me, are wrong. And what I love about Peterson is that he says you don't know anything. You're very small, the world is very big and you can't possibly grasp it. So have some bloody humility. And I think that's so true, because the world is incredibly complex and we all have to construct stories around it. But very few of us seem to have the courage to say, I don't know what the hell is going on. And I'm just little me. So let's listen to each other and try and work out what the hell is going on. But people are so scared of the chaos that involves, that the sheer magnitude of the problem, if you like, that they retreat into these little rigid narratives and say, well, that's the way things are, and I hate that. I mean, I really viscerally hate that. The idea that people insist, out of fear of the complexity of the world, and it's understandable, but, it leads to hell, it leads to Auschwitz, and it leads to the gulags. Once you are too scared of reality, and reality, after all, especially with the rise of the internet, has revealed itself to be so complex that the more complex it is, the more terrified we become, the more out of control the world seems to be, the more we retreat to our bunkers of certainty. And yet, if being human means anything in a kind of mentally evolutionary sense, it's tolerance of uncertainty. It's to be able to say, I don't know, let's work it out. And if you can't do that, what have we got? We've got totalitarianism. So I'm very much with Jordan Peterson on that. All the stuff about women, I mean, I think all that's, and the post, I think he's right about the postmodernists. I think he's right about the Marxists. I think he's quite right. So whether they're quite as powerful as he thinks they are, I don't know. But, I think he's identified a really clear and present danger. And he's had the courage to stand up for it, because I was talking to you before the cameras were running, is that the trouble with the postmodern neo-Marxist line is that it invariably puts you on the defensive. The moment they come at you with these ideas, you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a misogynist, you're LBGT averse, whatever, you're Islamophobe, the whole dialogue is about putting you on the back foot and making you feel, oh, I'm a bad person, I should shut. I know, all right, maybe you can go away and go, all right, I'm not going to engage with you, you think I'm a bad person. But the point is, you start to shut down. You start to be scared, to express your view. And I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, and you also drew some really interesting parallels with the show trials in communism, and this sort of sense of, we've all got this internalized sense of, well, there's something wrong, I've done something wrong at some point. That all of these, even the Spanish Inquisition, and I think that's the sort of truth that pretty much every great inquisitor has come to. It's like everyone has an internalized sense of shame around something. If you can tap into that.
Everybody wants to confess, and their sin, because they feel that they've done something wrong. I don't know if it comes out of childhood or some ancestral inheritance, but everybody deep in their heart feels they've done something wrong.
The Christian idea of original sin.
Yes, it is. It's certainly akin to that, and that need. And one of the most loathsome and pathetic spectacles I see is people desperately saying, I'm sorry I said that, I'll never say it again, because that just makes them even worse the moment. But it's sort of grovelling that goes on for people speaking what they see as their truth. But that is really under threat, I think, and it's not, and it's self-censorship, and it's by cutting, the BBC, which I've always been a huge admirer and supporter of. I think there's something in the idea that their agenda has become narrower and narrower and narrower, and they're thinking within very small boxes now, and I'm very reluctant to align myself with, say, the Daily Mail, which I loathe, detest and despise. Let me make that absolutely clear. But the idea that there's a kind of bias in the BBC, I think it's hard to argue against it. I think they are quite within that sort of cultural framework. You kind of know what they're going to say before they say it. There's not a real, which is why the intellectual dark web is developing so powerfully, is because the national broadcaster is not giving us those genuine, honest, inquisitorial conversations that they're used to. All we're really getting is this is what the BBC, although they would never put it that way, this is what our collective view is on morality. It goes back to the Reithian idea that we have to educate the public because they kind of fear the mob, and that's something again, coming from a working class background, I don't see the mob to be feared. All the working class people I knew, although they didn't have very appropriate opinions, were very decent, good people, and much better than their so-called betters, morally. So I don't have that fear of the mob. I trust people to be good people. But there's still that sort of elitist idea that, if we don't sort of educate these plebs out of their nativism, they're all going to be marching up and down, giving Nazi salutes, and beating up their wives, and that's just nonsense, I think.
There's so many things there to pick up on, like really interesting, because one of the things that you often hear is people on the left saying, oh, well, he talks about cultural Marxism, there's no such thing. And what you're expressing is, there's cultural Marxism. There's cultural Marxism in literature already, because people are, and I think I feel this as well. Like it's far more than politics. Like the most chilling effect is being had at the level of the dialogue, of what's allowed to be said and what's not allowed to be said.
Yes.
And that I think is where we both sort of share. Myself as a journalist, you as a novelist, both share a lot of concerns around what it means if you've got a public space where certain things are not allowed to be said.
I feel incredibly passionate about that. I mean, I just think, again, as a novelist, I've got to be allowed to be wrong, without being accused of being, 27 different things that are all, to some extent or other, evil or, to be disapproved of. The point is, I've got to have my characters be able to express the way real people are. I can't just say, this is the way they should be, because that's the death of literature, and that's why literature and arts in Russia died the moment the communists took over, from a wonderful, rich history of literature and art, suddenly dead, and same with Maoism, I mean, I don't know about the history of Chinese culture. I've got no idea. It's a very different culture, and now they seem to be emerging out of it in some ways. But I think it's terrifying for an artist what is happening, and what's particularly terrifying about it is quite a lot of artists are signing up to it. They're signing up for the sort of, I was most shocked of all. I know there are some shocking things that have happened in my lifetime. Certainly on the subject of the 7/7 bombings in London, I was shocked, and Salman Rushdie, how many of my so-called left colleagues, as it were apologists for what was happening, simply because they were anti-America, and therefore anything that sort of, anything that, and also cultural Marxism supposes that all cultures are equal, which I think is rubbish. I just don't think that all cultures are equal. I think some cultures are like people. Some are better than others, Some are nicer than, some are crueler than others. Some are more noble than others. Some are more, they're just like people, as Plato observed. And I think the idea that everything has a kind of equal value. I was going to say the most disgraceful moment of artists betraying their trade to me was when the Charlie Hebdo massacres took place, and the American Pen, after the award was given to Charlie Hebdo for the extraordinary bravery. I mean, my God, I knew they were in the front line of Islamic State at that time. They knew it, and they went on publishing, and not just, because they took the mickey out of Islam as they did with everything else. That's what they did. They were sort of the private eye of France, and that there were American writers stood there and refused to turn up for that ceremony because they disapproved of Charlie Hebdo. That made me want to be sick. I mean, I was so disgusted by those. And these are writers. These are writers that people should be right at the heart of free expression, and that they are selling that out, I think, is shocking beyond belief.
There's two things here. One, I've talked about, especially because you can look at this sort of wave of cultural Marxism and sort of what people can say and what they can't say, and all of this sort of media creation as, okay, we don't like it, But you can also look at it as it's backfiring tremendously. Look at Trump, look at Brexit. For me, those
Absolutely.
two things
Absolutely.
were direct responses to what I've kind of called the shadow of liberalism. This feeling of inclusivity that includes only people that sign up to this, and this, and anyone who doesn't think like that is a bigot,
Yes.
And I think especially in America, this is what's created the political backlash that we're seeing in the UK and the US. And this is, I cannot understand how progressives or supposed progressives cannot see this. That some of them are now sort of doubling down and like, oh wow, well it's far worse than we thought. That these people must be awful.
Even
awful
more
people.
evil than we thought they were.
Yeah, and yet before the American election, you had Milo Yiannopoulos, who is an openly gay man who talks about his black boyfriends getting mobbed. Like these are not personally bigoted people. This is something that didn't fit with the kind of narrative.
Well, that's it. And that people. I mean, I don't know much about Milo, but
I'm using that as one example.
But I mean, I do think that it's interesting that I think a lot of manifestations are appearing of political philosophies, both in political parties and sort of on the ground, as it were, that just don't fit anybody's particular narrative. The terms right and left do not really apply very well anymore. I can quite find it hard to put myself on that spectrum anymore. I don't really know what it means anymore, you know, and it's why I think there's this terrible panic to get Jordan Peterson in the right wing, you know, because, you know, he's not right wing, you know, he's not any wing. He's a thinker that has a lot of his own ideas. And you know, I mean, the Cathy Newman interview being a hilarious version of, you know, that's the most transparent version, I think, of what we were talking about, of people trying to be forced into a box, you know, by the dominant
So what you're saying
narrative. So what I'm saying, no, I'm not saying that. But, you know, it's very insidious. It's very dangerous, I think. I think something's changing. I don't know what, and I don't know how fast, and I don't know what's going to happen, you know. But I do think Jordan Peterson is someone who's had a lot of guts to stand up against, if you like, people who do not want to have this conversation, you know. And he's just saying, let's have the conversation. And he's got his point of view. Fair enough. Argue with him. Don't call him, you know, don't try and flush him down the toilet because he's a devil. You know, it's ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous. So I don't know. I don't know where this is all going to take us, David. I mean, you know, I'm not particularly optimistic, but as you say, things are changing, and there are shifts happening under the surface.
Yeah.
Where they're leading, I don't know. They could be leading to populism. They could be leading to, you know, they could be leading to a kind of mob rule. Certainly, that's what happened with Brexit to a certain extent. They could be empowering the elites. They could be leading to the breaking up of the postmodernist, neo-Marxist standpoint, or they could be increasing it. I don't really know. No one seems to know. It's just like, there was a very interesting Adam Curtis short film the other day. It suggested that the powers that be, if they exist, these powers that be, as opposed to it just being a chaotic slithering of different interest groups, the powers that be are almost willfully turning the narratives into snake pits of chaos, because it just makes you go, oh well, because you don't know what else to do but go, oh well, I don't know. You know, and I've many times been hit by that. Just, I can't deal with this anymore. I don't know what the hell's happening. You know, I just can't make sense of this anymore. And I think, you know, one could say, okay, that's just a phase that we're going through, and we'll come out of it. Or you could say, actually, there's intelligences behind it that are actually conspiring to make the world a more confusing, contradictory, and therefore manipulable place. And I don't know. I mean, I'm confused, you know, but at least I'm not afraid to admit that I'm confused.
Which helps.
Maybe, maybe.
I guess for me, the way that I can frame it is to just pull this apart. It's like you can have, and I wonder if I'd like to hear sort of maybe Jordan Peterson framing it in this way as well, because I do think like one of my criticisms of him would be that he certainly comes across as speaking in a very combative way when he talks about the left.
Yeah.
That I think is not going to help convert people. Like I think he's almost been like roped into one side of the culture war, and I think partly that's that he just keeps being dragged down to the political level by people who are interviewing him. But what I'd love to hear him say is something like, okay, these values that you hold so dear, equality, don't know if he could bring himself to say diversity, but certainly fairness as a value. These are good values, but if you make them your primary axioms, then you're in trouble. You're basically, every lesson from history shows that if you make fairness your primary determinant of a political system, you just end up in chaos, or you end up in hell almost immediately.
Well, that's one of the issues I have with Jordan Peterson, is that I think it's true that if you make fairness of outcome, if you like, the political aim, then you are in trouble. But I do believe in fairness, and I do believe that the system, as it were, is run in favour of the rich and powerful, and I do believe that the system has to be, to some extent, moderated by the state. You know, I grew up at a time when I was saved by the National Health Service. I was a very sickly baby. I was able to go to university and received a grant for it at the age of 27. You know, I went to a grammar school, you know, a good school from a working class area. The benefits of the state intervening to promote fairness is not something I'm against, but I can't get down with equality of outcome. I can certainly get down with equality of opportunity, and I think Peterson's the same. But I think he's spent too much time, I think, trying to be sort of an appâté la bourgeoisie, you know, person who's just going to go, I don't care if you don't like what I say. You know, he's got a bit drunk on that, I think, you know, and he might want to enter. It's not for me to say what, you know, he should do, but it would be wise, I think, if he could, you know, perhaps, like as you say, talk about, and he has talked about fairness. He does talk about the proper role of the left wing. He has talked about the fact that, you know, there is a place for that, but he's just very hidden, you know. And I think he might want to, you know, rather than be led all the time by what other people try to lead him into this snake pit of not very healthy narratives, to say, no, let's look at this side. You know, I'm, you know, and this is where I sometimes doubt how much he has invested in the idea of, you know, shall we say, I mean, he said he supports equality of opportunity, for instance. You know, okay, well, I'm completely down with that, but you don't really hear that from him very much. You know, and he should shout it from the rooftops. You know, he should, if he's got liberal and leftist credentials, if you want to call it that way, he should be shouting them from the rooftops. And you know, he doesn't very much. You know, I think he's quite anti-statist as well as being anti. But he supports he supports a public health system. He supports the national health, for instance, you know, which they have in Canada. I mean, it's not what the neoliberals want to do. It's not what the Conservatives want to do. Who want to strip back the state to nothing. So he's a much more nuanced thinker politically than he allows himself to be presented as, because he's got very, very overexcited perhaps by the idea of smashing down the canards of the radical left.
I think for me, it's this kind of realization that what started as really valuable contributions on the left, like marginalized voices being heard, a view of the people who are being left out of society, all that sort of stuff, and which is essential, has turned into something of a religion. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that it is actually being seen as a religion, and that blaspheming against it in any way, or being seen as a blasphemer against it in any way, is incredibly toxic, or is incredibly it's a career ending accusation to be thrown at someone, which is now starting to put certain topics off limits.
And that's very toxic, indeed. Yes, the human mind is a religious mind. We think religiously. We don't think rationally. You know, we think whether our religion is Christ or social or post-Marxism, postmodernism and neo-Marxism. They're all religions. You know, the liberal view is that, to go back to an earlier point, is that we don't know. You know, and that's the anti-religious point. That's saying, I don't know, let's work it out. That's what everything comes down to. Can we say to each other, I don't know, let's work it out? You know, not saying, and the religious view is, no, I already know. You know, and I think that's what I think Peterson puts his finger on with the totalitarian view. You know, is that it's he made the religious point that the devil is somebody who said they didn't need, or an entity that said they didn't need any knowledge outside of what they knew. You know, that was the beginning and end of reality, is what they knew. There was nothing beyond that. And that, in a strange way, is kind of where we're at. You know, with neo-Marxism and postmodernism, it's like, you know, the beginning and ending of the world is what I know, and that I know it. I look at it and think, I don't know anything. You know, and that's humility. And it's very prideful to say you're humble. And I'm not saying I am, but I do think humility is a virtue that should be very much treasured and aimed for, you know. And the idea and the beginnings of humility is to say it's a very, very tough world to understand. People are very complex. The world is very complex. And before you start organizing it, have a think about that, because you can end up in hell very quickly, you know, and you might have been born into a generation that didn't know hell, but it's happened time and time and time again throughout history, and it could happen very quickly now because of the internet and our interconnectedness. And I do think Peterson's right about the academy, i.e. the academic establishment is failing in its duty. You know, I don't think it's teaching people to think in the way that they once did. It's also become part of this malevolent kind of limitation of thought, you know. And when that's happening in the universities, which Peterson has talked a lot about, you know, you are training the next generation of leaders, and that's a dangerous path to go down, and that's the totalitarian mindset. You know, to me, you've got to have humility about what you know, and yet you've also got to have conviction about what you believe. So I have convictions about values, and one of those values is freedom, individual freedom of thought. Now I can't defend that to you in a logical way, except by introspection and thinking what's more precious to me than be able to think what I want to think. I mean, the evil of the communist societies was you weren't even able to think. And that's kind of the way we're going, is that, oh, I can't have that thought because it's a misogynist thought or a racist thought, so I won't have that thought. You know, although it might be an interesting thought, you know, and it might not be at all misogynist, it might not be at all racist, but you're scared to have that thought because that little kernel of guilt inside you is activated. You know, and I think that's a very dangerous place, given how collective we are as a species, how we love to join in with the mob, how we love to believe we're individuals by acting in a very unindividualistic way, how we love to have the approval of all the people around us, how we love to fit in, how we hate to stand out, how we, you know, and all these, our very, really, what we call it's group nature, tribal nature, you know, is only under the surface, and it's getting closer and closer to the surface, that tribalism, which is the opposite really of Enlightenment values, and says, no, we're not just a bunch of tribes, we're precious individuals.
Yeah, this is something I fear, because my sense is that some lessons have to be learned the hard way, and I have a sense that it's a big thing that we have lost is the lived experience of those who learnt those lessons the hard way, the Second World War generation. And that's what I fear, is that it's now a whole lifetime since the lessons were learned the hard way in the Second World War. And what we're seeing is, as we lose that sort of sense of those lessons being learned and all of the structures that were built up after the Second World War, that we may have to learn those lessons again the hard way. That's what I see coming.
One could also ask that question about the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is much more recent, and that's my maths is as bad as you, but that was 40 years later than the end of the Second World War. There's plenty of people who survived that, who can give their testimony to where that way of thinking lies, and you only have to pick up by Solzhenitsyn to know how those people. But is he on the list after all? He's an old white man. Does anyone bother reading him anymore? Why listen to Solzhenitsyn when he's an old white man with a beard? Because he's got. Why listen to Dostoevsky? He's a old dead white man. This is bullshit. You listen to voices that have something interesting to say, and once you start saying, "We don't listen to you because you belong to the wrong ethnic, gender group. We don't hear what you've got to say because it's only about power. All you've got to say is tainted by your desire," and which is just, that's a sick way of thinking about the world. It's just not true. It's just not true.
Yeah, and I want to pick up the point you made before about humility, because I think that's the really key point. And in my interview with Peterson, I asked him, what are the prerequisites for genuine knowledge? And he said, fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And he said, psychologically, that means that what you don't know is more important than what you know. That God, in this sense, is standing in for the mystery, or the sum total of the world that you don't know. And he said that you need to hold that as if your life depended on it.
I think that's a very important point, and it's something Peterson hasn't talked nearly enough about, which is what he means by God. When people think, oh, he's sort of a Christian or something, well, what does he mean by God? He doesn't make this point, but I've read enough of his stuff and looked at his lectures to know exactly what he means by God. What he means by God is all the stuff you don't know and don't understand, and the future, which you don't know and understand.
Well, that's one meaning of God, I guess.
There's two meanings, actually. But that he doesn't see it as some sort of supernatural entity that's going to guide your outcomes if you believe in him to some happy ending. He says that's the fundamental human orientation towards what they called God at the time of writing the Bible, was that thing that they couldn't control, that was really controlling them, and that they could bargain with it in the way that you could bargain with the future, in the way that you bargain with God, and that and at the same time the world, like God, is unknowable. So I wish he'd talk a lot more about what the hell he means by God. I heard him talking to Matt Delahunty about sort of God and taking LSD, and I thought, no, mate, you're on the wrong track here. Just tell them what you think. God, it's not mystical. It's actually, and I don't know really where he stands as I don't know how much of a Christian he is, but I think that really appeals to me, that idea, that the word God is not what we take it to mean. And this is how the meaning of the word developed as a powerful and often malevolent force that we have to deal with, and I think that's a good definition of God.
Which is a great place to end.
Yes. All right. Thanks very much, David. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah.